Good afternoon, and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. My name is Elizabeth Ciola, and I'm a fourth-year science leadership scholar in psychology at the University of Richmond. I've had the unique experience of interning at ADL for the past 2 summers, most recently as a technology policy intern on the civil rights team. I am pleased to be the moderator of From Quad to the Keyboard, how students are experiencing a more virtual college experience. Please let me introduce today's speakers. First, we have Julio Gonzalez, who is a second-year law student at the University of Houston Law Center, where he currently serves as vice president of the LGBTQ plus student organization, Outlaw, the vice president for the Latinx Law Students Association, and participates in Moot Court, Mock Trial, and the Immigration Clinic. Secondly, we have Blake Flayton, who is a junior at George Washington University and a progressive activist in democratic politics and on social media. He is also a writer on Jewish issues and anti-Semitism, and is an advocate for Jewish students and believes anti-Semitism on college campuses and within the progressive movement is a serious issue that must be addressed and combated. Lastly, we have Julia Jassy, who is a second-year student at the University of Chicago. She is the co-founder and co-director of Jewish on Campus and co-host of the podcast Jewish Identity Crisis. Julia draws from her distinct background as an American Jewish woman, as an advocate and activist for the Jewish community. Throughout this panel, we will be covering a variety of topics. Specifically, we will discuss the climate for Jewish students and the growing phenomenon of the Jewish on Campus social media platform, intersections of work against anti-Semitism and progressive activism, the intersection of anti-racism and progressive movements, free speech on campus and building constructive conversations about politics and inclusion, online hate and harassment and how reporting and support have shifted, community building and allyship in an online environment, updates on how BDS is showing up in other anti-Israel narratives coming from mainstream places such as the American Friends Service Committee, and last but not least, ADL's work fighting anti-Semitism on campus and the exercise of free speech. To begin, I'd like to go to Julio and ask him to briefly describe how he sees the First Amendment come into play here, especially with the intersection of free speech and hate speech.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So essentially, to start off, when we talk about free speech, when we engage in these conversations on what exactly free speech is, there are a lot of legal questions surrounding, what it encompasses and how hate speech fits into that. Whether or not hate speech should be protected, regulated, and if so, to what extent. So to clarify right off the bat, hate speech is not just uncomfortable speech. It's not just a disagreement, and it's not just dissent. See, hate speech is speech which has historically been used to harm or incite violence against a marginalized group. It pushes past the realm of discomfort because it's not just something that makes someone else feel upset. It can create real mental, emotional, and physical threats or dangers. See, hate speech is often protected by the Constitution at our institutions of higher learning. It's something that, professors, students, and people across the legal field alike have kind of argued to maintain in order to protect our First Amendment right. And the complication with regulating it, with restricting it, limiting it, is that one person's idea of hate speech can completely contradict another person's idea of hate speech. And so when hate speech encompasses such an expansive scope, it's important to shift the conversation, I think, from a solely legal conversation to incorporate a more morally led and socially constructed idea of free speech and hate speech and the dichotomy as well. So I think the important thing to take away is that in our quest for understanding the scope of hate speech and balancing it with our rights to free speech, we have a duty to understand the way we use and consume speech. Because our speech, regardless of our intent, regardless of we would classify it as hate or if another would classify it as hate speech, has very real consequences for others all the time. So we must always examine the power dynamics of those speaking and those who the speaking is directed at or about. For example, hate speech from a marginalized person may cause discomfort but it is not power. Hate speech from someone who reinforces the status quo, who has the power to create policy, who is higher on the political or social hierarchy, that is power. And context matters, because power can look one way in a localized environment within your very specific community, and power can look another way in a global context. We need to critically examine how the concept of hate speech has been co-opted and weaponized by members of an oppressive group when members of the targeted or oppressed group speak out in opposition. When a system has inequity built into its very foundations, we must interrogate why free speech must necessarily mean the same opportunities for speech for all. Rest assured, our First Amendment right to free speech is one of the most important in the country because it allows us to continue to speak for ourselves. It allows communities who are marginalized to continue to dissent, to present opposition. But there's a fine line between hate speech and free speech that in both the legal realm and in our everyday lives, we still need to learn how to navigate.
For sure. And I think that's one of the topics that we'll definitely be getting into today, specifically because we so often see and hear about colleges and universities really encouraging free speech, but not necessarily being accepting of it, or it leading into what we see today and kind of referred to as cancel culture. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Julia, how you see free speech on campus and building constructive conversations about politics and inclusion, while free speech might not also be accepted.
Yeah, well, to begin, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be here speaking with you all. This is something I had to grapple with quite a bit. So I grew up on Long Island, New York, which is a place known for having quite a bit of a Jewish population. I am a second generation Israeli American. My father's side of the family was saved from the Holocaust by America. My mother's side of the family was saved by ethnic cleansing in Spain and Yemen and Iraq by Israel. And my connection to Israel was never something that was called into question growing up in a place where it was pretty normal to have a connection to Israel. But when I got to college, this is something that I had to confront, and I wasn't exactly ready for it yet. I go to the University of Chicago, which is a school that is known for and prides itself upon this idea of free speech. Intellectual curiosity, free speech, and academic freedom are central tenets to what it means to be a student at UC. But like at any other university, this is not always true in application. And there is no exception among student body and professors who do perpetuate these instances of anti-Semitism by silencing the voices of students who do have connections to Israel. So first of all, these conversations about Israel and about any other issue about anti-Semitism or bigotry in general should be discussed on college settings. They should be encouraged as a form of free speech. But one thing that we're seeing is that they aren't being encouraged. What we're seeing is that when a student does talk about their personhood, misconstrued assumptions about their identity are being displayed. So we see that this idea of academic freedom has to include academic freedom from indoctrination. So academic freedom as a concept exists to embolden students to challenge preconceived notions through exposure to multiple ways of thinking. However, in my experience as a student and the experiences of students around the world, academic freedom has often been used as a get-out-of-jail-free pass to allow for Jew hatred and blood libel to be perpetuated by students and professors alike. This has contributed to an environment where students are reluctant to share their own perspectives or realities for fear that it will cause a professor to lower their grade or peers to socially ostracize them. If we are only exposed to one side of the conversation, what does this mean? What this means is that students in college today are the ones who are going to continue to be lawmakers, who are going to continue to be policymakers, who are going to continue to be people of tremendous influence in the future, 15 years from now. And we see what happens when this conversation is limited. Just today is the anniversary of when 1975, the United Nations passed a resolution to call Zionism a form of racism, which was a facet of Soviet Union propaganda, which endured for 16 years due to one side of the conversation being stifled. So we know that this is a problem. How do we solve it? The key is to not limit more speech, but to allow for more speech to be shared. So the key is not to indoctrinate students with just one way of thinking on one side or the other. It's not to create a monolith. It's to expand perspectives by sharing multiple viewpoints. And we don't really see this happening anywhere in the country right now. And that's a big problem. It's expanding further and further to cause many students like myself in the past to have not been able to share their side of the story. And we see this a lot happening online now, at schools online, life is online because of coronavirus. We live in a time of immense social progress, which is so inspiring and has inspired so many students from different minority communities like myself to share our stories and uplift our voices. What we are seeing is this spread of information online that is not always truly accurate. The idea of an infographic being spread to share a complex topic like Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within a 10-slide Instagram post is often a form of virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is basically when you feel a social pressure to share that you are aware without truly understanding what you're sharing. And the more that people see these graphics and don't understand the complexity of what they're discussing, the less nuance there is in the conversation. These graphics can be used for good. I use them. Jewish on Campus uses them. I'm sure basically any activist at this point does use graphics, but we can't limit our knowledge to this. And what that has begun is it has created this culture of online harassment of students who do speak out against them. I've been called vicious names online along with many other students. Professors are able to use this idea of academic freedom to speak carte blanche. I've been in classrooms where professors have alluded to the violent decolonization of Israel-Palestine, which, yes, is protected by free speech, but also calls into question the safety and survival of my family and families like mine. This is not just my experience. Looking through the stories shared with my Jewish on Campus organization, it is very troubling to see. From around the country and around the world, students have shared their stories with us. Stories that mitigate the reality of anti-Semitism as a form of hatred and bigotry. Stories that mitigate the reality of anti-Semitism as a personal connection to Israel. And stories that promote a biased perspective on the conflict. Just to share a couple of stories that have been submitted to us. A student from the University of Cape Town explains that a professor said that the Holocaust was not as bad as apartheid because all Jews are white. A professor at the University of Vermont said that LGBTQ plus students at UVM are not allowed to carry flags or banners with Stars of David on them to campus pride events because it looked too much like the Israeli flag. At UC Berkeley, students claim that the Jewish-owned media kept the truth hidden. These are all examples of speech that is being protected by free speech, but isn't contributing to anything but danger for the Jewish community. So this nuance has to be acknowledged. And finally, I think the way to combat this is to empower and embolden students to speak up against it, which is very hard to do when you are in a situation that speaking up will lead to social. Speaking up will target you as a student who's speaking out against this monolithic way of thinking. What inspired me to finally speak up was to see others in the Jewish community doing it too. I was nervous because I knew that the backlash would occur, like it does for any other minority group that is speaking. And when I started to create this forum of Jewish on Campus, organization of Jewish on Campus, to be a place where students can not only have their voices heard, but to make it clear that our voices should be heard. I realized how important it was to speak up. Something I've realized, and something that my rabbi has told me quite a bit, is that we have to stop looking at our history of persecution as a reminder of our collective pain, but as a reminder of our collective resiliency. This is not the first time that we faced a roadblock or faced hatred in any capacity. And the idea of Am Yisrael Chai, the idea of pride for our religion, heritage, people, and nation, is to see resilience and strength in that.
All right. So, Blake, now looking at you, I think that we so often see a very big difference in how certain thoughts and ideas manifest themselves on campus. And I know this is something that you have definitely seen and have written about. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you think BDS manifests itself on campus and kind of the discrepancy between policies and actions.
Of course. So, I just kind of want to slow it down a little bit and just talk about specifically what the experience is on campus and what kind of we're talking about in regards to anti-Semitism, in regards to anti-racism, and specifically in regards to the BDS movement. So the BDS movement advertises there's a very big difference, an enormous difference between the way the BDS campaign wants us to believe what it is doing and what it is actually doing on campus. The BDS movement advertises itself as a political campaign to put pressure on Israel to comply with international law. BDS postures itself as being a political campaign to address human rights abuses in Israel-Palestine and to hold Israel to account for, as I said, abuses and wrongdoing, and to create a more just atmosphere in the Israel-Palestine region, and to advocate free speech on campus by way of criticizing Israel, criticizing Zionism, and having student dialogue about the wrongdoings of the Israeli government. That's what they want us to believe they are doing. However, that is not what is actually happening. And this is where I kind of want to push back against the notion that, hate speech can't be hate speech if it's coming from a marginalized group, because there's kind of a difference of power dynamics. I really want to push back against that, because what we see from the BDS movement is not discussion of Israeli policy, not discourse that is well within the confines of respectable discussion on Israel-Palestine. What we see from the BDS campaign is the branding of Jewish Zionist students as white supremacists, as racists, as colonizers, as imperialists, as fascists, as, far-right Trump supporters. And what that does is it completely eliminates any reasonable discussion about Israel-Palestine, and it instead trespasses, if you will, into anti-Semitic territory. Because anti-Semitism has always operated by assigning the Jew, or the collective Jews, with the worst traits imaginable, the worst characteristics imaginable. And as I said before, Zionists and Jews on campus are assigned the traits of white supremacists, of oppressor, of privilege, of racism. And therefore, by those constructs, anybody can say anything they want against Israel, against Jewish students, against Hillel, against Birthright, against Jewish organizations and Jewish activities on campus. And regardless of how offensive it is, regardless of how wrong or libelous or emotionally or politically charged it is, again, not having anything to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're talking here about Holocaust denial. We're talking here about intended antagonization of Jewish students. It's okay because it's seen as punching up, right? The BDS movement has been very successful at framing. There's a worldview on campus and in progressive spaces that the world is easily divided between those who are oppressor and those who are oppressed. And those who are in the oppressor category can never, ever be legitimately targeted by those in the oppressed category. And that is what the BDS movement has been very successful framing the Jewish people as. And so really what happens is we enter this environment where anything can be said against Israel, anything can be said against Jewish students, no matter how offensive, no matter how egregious, no matter how libelous, and it is seen as social justice. It is seen as punching up. It is seen as speaking truth to power, because that is the way that the BDS movement has framed this discourse. And that becomes very, very problematic, because when Jewish students speak out against it, they are then framed as all of the things that, again, are the worst traits imaginable: racists, far-right operatives, fascists, white supremacists. So now we can see that this kind of argument, this discussion, has very little to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and everything to do with very classical anti-Semitic tropes and just a simple mutation of the centuries-old hatred that we call anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like there's a little bit of an intersection between your work as a Jewish activist, an advocate for Jewish students, and a progressive activist, if there's anything that you would like to touch on with that aspect as well.
Of course. So as I said before, the whole crux of this issue is that, a lot of Jewish students arrive on campus wanting to be a part of progressive advocacy movements, right? We want to be involved in racial justice. We want to be involved in environmental justice and labor justice. These are things that we were excited to be a part of, and these are the spaces that we want to thrive in. However, we are constantly being expected to sacrifice parts of our identity in order to be accepted into these spaces. And the reason why is because those parts of our identity, by way of I'll call it hyper-leftist activism, and by a way of a kind of postmodern worldview, says that things like Zionism and even things like Jewishness are a part of an oppressive apparatus, are a part of racism, are a part of colonialism, are a part of privilege and power. And so we find ourselves compromised because these are things that we've always, accepted as being just part of our identity, part of who we are, part of our place in the world. But they're being framed as evil. And that, again, has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because neither I nor Julia nor any other Jewish student is directly responsible for the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu. It has everything to do with anti-Semitism. It is the intentional removing of Jewish voices from progressive spaces and making Jewish students feel uncomfortable in the spaces that we were most excited to be a part of. And that's something that in the progressive movement is seen very vividly in the British Labour Party, which is very much in the news right now. And it is something that is rising in the progressive movement in the United States. And perhaps most chilling, perhaps most disturbing about these trends that come from this worldview that the world can be separated into good guys and bad guys, right? Perhaps most distressing about it is when Jewish students speak out, right? When Jewish students say, that's wrong, that's offensive, that's anti-Semitic, we are then smeared as just acting in bad faith, intentionally targeting people of color, silencing criticism of Israel, silencing dissent, trampling on free speech, all the things that were leveled against the courageous Jews in Britain who spoke against Jeremy Corbyn. So this is a trend in the progressive movement, and I believe we have to take it seriously.
I would completely agree. And I also would like to pose kind of a similar question and response question for Julio to answer. How do you see the push and pull of power dynamics and speech in response to some of the occurrences Blake was mentioning, and in your work kind of overlapping between anti-racism and progressive movements?
Absolutely. So the fascinating thing about identity is that power dynamics are fluid. In some contexts, you may be the status quo, the member and beneficiary of an oppressive group. And in other contexts, you may be on the complete flip side. So I know Blake pushed back on the idea that hate speech can't be hate speech if it's coming from a marginalized group. And to clarify, yes, everyone is capable of spewing hate speech because everyone is capable of prejudice, point blank. But I do think there's a fundamental difference regarding the impact of who or where this speech comes from. To be clear, anti-Semitism is intolerance, point blank. Generalizations about the Jewish identity and the Jewish community is just, it's unacceptable in any realm, and especially in the progressive movement, where we are all striving towards liberation of all these interlocking oppressive systems. But by that same token, I'm also cautious to characterize, entire groups as one thing for the same reasons that all of us as progressives kind of navigating our own identities and our own roles in these movements are, figuring that out for ourselves as well. I think Julia touched on this a little earlier about, and it's something that I think we can all recognize of the importance of free speech in terms of continuing dialogue and continuing the opportunities for education for growth. And I absolutely agree. Speech is crucial to allow for nuance because these things are not black and white, cut and dry. And complexity should not be sacrificed for the sake of clear-cut definitions. So yeah, I think it's important to think about the way that we engage with speech, free speech, hate speech, all of the above, and what impact our speech has beyond just the words that leave our lips, but how that speech is then developed into policy, developed into social norms, developed into laws, and the ways in which we are all, regardless of our identities. I think about myself as like a queer Latinx person, of even in spaces of, as like a cisgender person, when we're talking about trans issues, like there's still that fluidity in my role as a member of an oppressive group versus a member of an oppressed group. When you think about the anti-Blackness that runs rampant in the Latinx community, and kind of how that forces me to also, interrogate my own role in whichever group I come, I take capacity in a given moment. I think that is one of the most important takeaways, is recognizing the fluidity of it, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Julio. And I did kind of want to backtrack a little bit to one point you made, and recognize that you're in the unique position of having been an undergraduate and now a graduate at the law level. And I wanted to ask, in your experience, how does this conversation around free speech and hate speech and enacting policies differ among undergraduates and graduate students?
I did a lot of speech and communications work in my undergraduate career, and I think it allowed for a lot more freedom. It allowed for a much more liberating approach. It was exciting, to come into my own as someone who was becoming socially conscious, and someone who just was recognizing all the injustices of the world and wanted to use my voice, as a tool of empowerment for myself and for others. And then you transition into law school, which is a really interesting environment, because the thing about law schools is that law school, higher education in general, kind of like graduate school programs and the like, is that they can be simultaneously hyper political and apolitical at the same time. And, on one end, law schools are hyper political in that they quite literally create attorneys, judges, professors, politicians, the people who design and interpret the law. And on the other hand, you have students or faculty members who remain politically neutral, so as to not appear biased, so as to not isolate themselves, so as to not cause any sort of commotion, like Blake and Julia had mentioned earlier. So we see instances of hate speech being used, or in the form of racial slurs, under the guise of upholding academic integrity. It's used as academia, and even if it's used as academia, even if it's legally protected, it doesn't mean it's not violent or triggering to students who are affected. I think about just sitting in a constitutional law class that all law students are required to take, and quite literally any identity of a marginalized group, LGBTQ, people of color, Jewish people, Muslim people, has had to read a case involving a court deciding their rights, and has had to entertain a debate from other students, team members, about those respective rights. So yeah, it can be acknowledged to reinforce the cruel history of the legal system without being used explicitly at the expense of marginalized students, I feel. But I also think, to echo some of the earlier sentiments being made, on the other end of that, there's the fear of employers finding out, what you said or posted online. There's the fear of just so much isolation and ostracization that you can suffer, that more often than not, I feel that speech that can be productive for a conversation is actually just stifled and never happens.
I would agree with that. I think a lot of the times we get bogged down in the rhetoric and don't actually think about the impact our words are having. And on that note, I want to shift into the Q&A portion of the panel. And before we get started, we're seeing a lot of questions come in from parents and grandparents of college students here who are asking about how to find resources to better support students. And you can look out for a follow-up from ADL after this panel with some more information on that. But I would like to transition into the Q&A and specifically start off by asking about any solutions to bring people together that you'll have seen in your experience or that you think could be really beneficial. And Julia, I want to pose this to you first and see how you have seen this happen in your experience with Jewish on campus, and if you think that social media could be a good tool in this aspect.
Yeah. So I touched upon this a bit earlier. There is this complexity in the role of social media in progressive movements and in social movements in general. So on one hand, we do see these posts being shared that can be very limited in their scope. But what they do serve to do is to start a conversation. And that's what the role Jewish on Campus has begun to step in to, has been, and what we see ourselves expanding forward to do. When we share our stories, we open a dialogue. And the more students that share their stories, the more inspired they are to continue this cycle of sharing. So when I first went to college, about things that I knew would be controversial, because my identity is something that I hold very close to my heart and very proud of, and I don't want that to be questioned publicly. But the more that I saw other students sharing their identities, the more inspired and proud I was to share my own. And the more that I've shared my own, the more I've seen other students begin to do the same. So there's this cycle of conversation that begins once you do start to share. And when I began Jewish on Campus with my colleagues and my friends, there was definitely a tremendous amount of backlash that we faced and continue to face from people who might not see anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, or who might not understand the complexity and the gravity of anti-Semitism as a problem today. As we've begun working, though, I've noticed that we get more students with time that reach out to us saying, I didn't know how to start talking about this. I didn't know how to be the first person to post something because I knew what would come with it. And your platform gave us the opportunity to feel empowered to share our stories. So my message on how to combat it is to hatred kind of pass over you. Don't connect to those, because they will happen. No matter what minority group you're a part of, when you talk about your experiences, you will face the throes of hatred from right and left, from everywhere in between. And that will happen. That will continue to happen. But that's not what you should connect to. What you should connect to are the stories of people from your group and from others who either learned something from you or were inspired to continue speaking because of what you do. And the more that you start to speak, the more others will continue to speak, and you open the door for more conversation, and that is how we combat it.
Thank you, Julia. And I also did want to ask, you're in a unique position where you are living on campus and around campus, but your classes are fully online. And I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about how you see those two spaces intersect, the physical and virtual space, and if you've seen people be more open and willing to have a dialogue in person after first addressing it in the online space.
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's something I've grappled with quite a bit recently. So in person, it's hard to speak out because there's a direct response, direct engagement. There's no time to think. There's no time to research. There's no time to sit with your thoughts before you react, which you have on the harassment that I've faced and I've seen other students face has occurred online. In person, though, is where a lot of these conversations exist. In person, meaning a face-to-face conversation, a phone call, a direct message, these interpersonal conversations, creating a sense of empathy for the person that you're speaking to. Now, I've had a number of students post things that were pretty hateful, as most other Jewish activists have faced about me, which has happened before. But it's in these conversations with friends, it's in these conversations in person and on the phone and online, where students are asking me questions. My friends and my peers are asking me questions saying, Julia, you're very passionate about this issue, and I don't really understand why. Can you explain it to me? And those conversations end much more positively than you think that they would. So I think that having that interpersonal relationship with people that you're talking to, presenting your story as a human being and not as just this activist figure, is so important, because we are people before we are anything else. And these stories are identities before they are tools to be used in the political sphere.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, I want to kind of kick it to you, Blake, and ask, now that you are in a fully virtual environment where GW is fully online and you're not on campus, do you see that there's a lot more discussion happening on social media? Are people more comfortable kind of voicing their opinions, hiding behind a screen? And kind of how have you seen the fully virtual environment impact this issue?
Of course. So this summer, we saw a dramatic increase in social media activism. For those of you who don't have Instagram accounts, I refer to it as the summer of the infographic. After George Floyd was murdered, after the Breonna Taylor case started getting more attention, people really took it upon themselves to use social media, and specifically Instagram, as a way to convey messages of social justice. The infographics were a very accessible way to learn about issues, to learn more about how different sides of an issue thought about a certain thing, and to really educate college students on a lot of hot button progressive issues that we all want to be advocates for, right? Our generation is very politically active. Our generation likes activism. We like being, in the room where it happens. We want to have that activism label. However, what started to happen almost immediately was, of course, like happens all the time with a trend in social media, a lot of disinformation being shared. And unfortunately, there's nobody on social media to fact check disinformation if it's coming from a 19-year-old college student. And within this realm of social justice, and specifically anti-racist social justice spaces, we are presented on social media again with the dichotomy that I talked about earlier. And the dichotomy separates the world into two different camps: those who are oppressors and those who are oppressed, those who are those who are privileged and powerful, and those who are marginalized and powerless. And therefore, a person, an individual, becomes an avatar for their identity, right? And unfortunately, as we are seeing not only just on social media, but across the country in this dialogue, is that Jews are time and time again placed in the powerful category, incapable of being oppressed by those who are not in the powerful category. In order to get likes and shares and retweets, these social media activists will cram in a bunch of buzzwords that they know are going to rile up, Gen Z, right? Again, white supremacy, fascism, apartheid, colonialism, imperialism. And when these things are attached to labels like Israel, or attached to labels like AIPAC, or attached to labels like just Zionist in general, what happens is it starts finding its way into the discourse where, again, I'm going to reiterate, it becomes completely okay to say everything and anything you want against Israel, Zionism, Jewish students, no matter how offensive, no matter how egregious, no matter how libelous, because it's portrayed, it has been successfully framed by this activist crowd as social justice, as punching up, as speaking truth to power. And so what we see on social media is a pro-BDS infographic saying things about Israel that are not true, saying things about Zionism that are so emotionally charged that it has much less to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than we think it does. And it's being spread everywhere, right? And because it contains those buzzwords that the BDS movement has made sure are associated with Zionism, those evil, hateful buzzwords, because those messages contain those buzzwords, they are shared en masse. With nobody to fact check them, with nobody to say this is anti-Semitic or this is hateful. And that's super problematic, and we're seeing it more and more.
Thank you so much. I can definitely attest to the summer of the infographic. I felt like every time I checked any form of social media, they were always there. But I do want to pivot a little bit. We've talked about this a little bit. I think each of you have hit on it. We all hold both marginalized and privileged identities, and we have to deal with this intersection and battle of them. And this often makes it a very hard situation to kind of ask administrators for help and support. But I'm going to ask each of you to briefly respond. What would you hope that administrators would do, considering that they serve all students, both marginalized, privileged, and in between? And we can start with Julio, if that's okay.
Yeah. You got me first already. I would say I don't think that productive free speech, which might sometimes include internalized biases being communicated, can exist on a campus if there is not a healthy culture, and it's not a safe environment for those ideas to be exchanged. And I think that starts from the top down, as much as as much as it goes from bottom up. And I think it's not a matter of dictating who can say what to what extent. It's a matter of, from the very beginning, if we're gonna allow certain forms of speech under the guise of academic integrity, under the guise of creating ongoing dialogue to further educational advancement, there needs to be norms and just cultural attitudes in place where students feel safe and okay and comfortable expressing those types of ideas. So I
would definitely agree with that. Thank you for being brave enough to go first. Julia or Blake, would one of you particularly like to go next?
I'd be happy to speak on this because this is a lot of the work that Jewish on Campus has begun doing and sees ourselves stepping into as an organization. So we work directly with a lot of students from different universities talking about how to address this. And the common way thrown out is the IRA definition. The IRA definition being the most widely accepted and most comprehensive explanation of what anti-Semitism is and defining it. Now, the interplay of IRA and free speech on a college campus is really interesting because it encompasses two things. It encompasses professors and faculty, and it encompasses student body and student culture. So how we balance those two things is really interesting, and how that applies on a campus level is different depending on different campuses. What we need to see is that the conversation around Jewish identity has to be comprehensive. Jewish students have to be included in such examples, ethnic studies programs. We are an ethno-religious group, and that deserves to be something that we are spoken about along with others. We need to be included in our indigenous ties to Israel, the same way we'd want any other group to be included in their indigenous ties to their homeland. There has to be an even assessment of conversation across the board for Jewish students, as there should be for any other minority group. And this is the way that IRA can not only exist as a template of what anti-Semitism should be on a campus, but how it's able to be implemented in a way that works with universities that have comprehensive rules on free speech to encourage further conversation around Jewish identity in Israel-Palestine without marginalizing Jews in the process.
You know, the one thing that is going to fix this on college campuses, this kind of scourge of anti-Semitism that we are seeing, is just, we need people to understand, both students and administrators, that anti-Semitism can come from anywhere. Anti-Semitism can come from any community, anti-Semitism can come from any organization, and anti-Semitism can come from any part of the ideological political spectrum. You know, there was a vote on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism at my school a short couple weeks after a student was caught on camera advocating for the bombing of Israel and saying, "You Jewish pieces of," I'll edit that part out. And you know, at the meeting when we were discussing this definition, the Jewish students who wanted to adopt the IHRA, again, the criticisms leveled against us had nothing to do with Israeli policy. We were called white supremacists, we were called racists, we were called colonizers, we were called imperialists. We were actually called online Zionist scum. You know, there's been several instances on my campuses of people wearing Jewish attire being followed on the quad with words being leveled against them. Specifically me, after the coronavirus outbreak started, I was followed by a group of people who were yelling, "You produced it, you produced it, you started it." And really, we need to understand that, you know, after the vote happened, there was Jewish students crying and hugging each other in the auditorium because we were heartbroken that we had just been born, we had just witnessed such hatred, such vitriol, such charged rhetoric that we knew was much more sinister than anything about Israel or Palestine. But because it didn't come from some place that the culture has designated as oppressive, as hateful, because it didn't come from that place, it wasn't taken seriously. And that's why anti-Semitism is not being taken seriously on college campuses. Because if there's a swastika drawn in the snow, or if there's a Heil Hitler etched into a bathroom stall, obviously we're all in agreement that that's anti-Semitism, and the school does well to condemn it. But if a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter shares a Der Strömer cartoon on their Instagram, or shares a cartoon that David Duke had on his website, or in protest against Israel or Zionism, an SJP chapter posts eviction notices on Jewish students' doors who oppose the BDS resolution. And the list can go on and on. So you can just look on Jewish on Campus, their Instagram page, to see the horrific things that we're dealing with. Students write to me all the time. A student walks into a class with a Hebrew bumper sticker on her hydro flask and is called a Nazi, and the professor doesn't say anything. These are all instances of anti-Semitism that all need to be addressed and grappled with the same intensity as anti-Semitism that comes from the quote-unquote people who are able to be oppressors, the powerful people, the privileged people. So again, we need to reiterate that anti-Semitism can come from anywhere, that there is a line that can be crossed when discussing, Israel and into anti-Semitic territory. And the ADL has done really well to map out what that means. That means if you're delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel, or holding Israel to double standards, that is anti-Semitism. And more often than not, on college campuses, we see that coming from progressive spaces, from progressive students. And because it does, it is ignored. And not only that, to make it worse, but the students who object, who could be progressive, like myself, who could be, consider themselves a progressive activist, very left-leaning. The students who object and say you can't say those things, they are then vilified, isolated, and ostracized as just the worst characteristics imaginable in America. And if that's not anti-Semitism, pushing Jews out of the spaces where they felt comfortable because they felt uncomfortable, I don't know what is. I really don't know what is. And again, this pushes far beyond the discourse surrounding Israel-Palestine, and is well within reason to characterize as the same anti-Semitic tropes that have been used since medieval Europe, just mutating and using language of social justice to disguise itself and to make itself more appealing to progressive students and to the progressive culture.
Thank you so much for sharing, each of you. I know that was a particularly difficult question. I do want to ask one more question before we wrap up our discussion. There have been a few questions about ways to respond to harmful speech in a way that people will listen. And I know, Julia, you touched on this earlier, and I don't know if you particularly want to answer, or if Julio or Blake, you would like to step in and add anything, but I'll leave that up to you three.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. So this is something that I kind of had been on both sides for. When I first came to college, it wasn't something that I had dealt with before. And my response was something that I wasn't proud of. My response was kind of to just walk away. I've faced Holocaust jokes in the law. I faced accusations of apartheid against Israel in the law, and I kind of just walked away. And that made me uncomfortable. The idea that I wasn't able to respond, the idea that I wasn't able to formulate an articulate and meaningful response to these accusations made me very uncomfortable. So what I did was I learned. I learned from peers. I learned from myself. I did research. And now this knowledge set fortifies me to know that when these accusations are thrown at me, when this harmful speech is thrown at me, I know how to respond in a way that is both productive, articulate. And that, I think, is the biggest thing. It's very hard to defend your humanity. It's hard emotionally, and it's hard intellectually to grapple with. So coming into the conversation, having looked at resources, either online from Jewish activists or online from different resources that the ADL and other Jewish organizations put forward about the history of these anti-Semitic tropes and the reality behind them. That's the best piece of advice I have on confronting these conversations. I think that education is a very valuable tool. That fight with just passion, we have to fight with passion and knowledge. And those two things together give us a really strong and legitimate backbone and ethos when coming to the conversation.
And let me just add to that if I can, because I think this is really an important solution. We need to be on the front lines of liberalism, right? We need to be on the front lines of the principles of the Enlightenment, that I, as a Jewish person, am not an avatar for my identity, right? For the Jewish identity, that the world cannot be separated into good guys and bad guys. The world cannot be separated into those who can only ever be oppressed and marginalized, and those who can ever only be oppressive and privileged and powerful. Those types of dichotomies that we are being sold on campus, that we are being taught in the classroom, that we are being indoctrinated with on social media, especially in the progressive movement, are not only hindering the progressive movement and hurting the progressive movement, but they're also hurting Jews, because Jews, since forever, have championed the concepts of individualism, particularism, and just individuality and uniqueness, and in the way that we perceive the world and in the way that the world perceives us. And we need to continue to fight for those ideas, and fight for the ideas that all people deserve to be respected, deserve to be heard. All people have the right to free speech within the classroom, and stop drawing these lines as to who can insult one other person, who can't, who can speak at a club meeting and who can't, based on where they are in this kind of pyramid of oppression. It's got to stop. And it's something that is being seen now as these students who are kind of marinating in this ideology are graduating into our institutions. It's the reason why, the New York Times sees no problem publishing a piece that is very flattering to Louis Farrakhan. It's those types of consequences that we see happening all over the place.
Thank you. And Julio, if you have any thoughts on that as well, please feel free to ask them. And there was also one question about specifically towards you, because you're in a unique position where I'm not Jewish and you're not Jewish. So just about any misconceptions you might have had about anti-Semitism that you've heard, as well as just adding your thoughts on the last question.
Yeah. To start off with the last question, I think Julia made a really important point about the power of education, because there's really nothing in your tool belt like being able to just come back with a very articulate, very well-rounded argument. At the same time, however, I think that we run into a lot of instances where this speech and this hatred isn't coming, in the context of a productive conversation or dialogue for the sake of learning. It's just coming from pure bigotry, from pure hatred. And so my kind of personal philosophy, and I guess some solution and advice that I would like to pass on, is the ability to filter through your anger. And that is not to say don't get angry, because anger is, one, inevitable, and two, very useful. But you have to critically examine which anger empowers you and which anger kills your spirit. Because there is a difference, and you may not be at fault for where that anger comes from, but you are responsible for how you direct it. And I think, as individuals, as advocates or just regular people, like, this is what we're dealing with for the rest of our lives, and we have to know how to maintain sustainability of ourselves and our communities. And to answer your second question, can you repeat that question again? I'm sorry.
Yes, of course. It was just if you've heard any misperceptions of anti-Semitism. Yeah,
and I think the other two panelists spoke to them a lot. I mean, the types of sentiments and the types of commentary that they're providing aren't exclusive to undergraduate campuses. I think in progressive movements especially, there's still that lack of nuance for understanding all the different ways in which oppression and biases can manifest among different groups and among different identities. And I think it's something that a lot of us still have a lot of growth in, and a lot more understanding to come at. Just like with every other topic and with every other identity that we might not directly identify with.
Thank you so much. And I know that we're about to run out of time, but I do want to take just a minute to thank all three of you for engaging in this thoughtful discussion today. I mean, I'm a student and you gave me so much to think about, but I do feel inspired hearing all of you talk about how you would like to go about solving all of the issues we are facing. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.